The Vietnam War, lasting 20 years, was a proxy war of the Cold War, essentially between capitalism and communism. Many of Vietnam's problems go back to World War II. Historically, the region known as Indochina belonged to the French, but during the war, the Japanese annexed the land. A communist revolutionary by the name of Ho Chi Minh returns to Vietnam and creates headquarters in a cave in the north. He establishes the Viet Minh, a nationalist communist group whose goal is to rid Vietnam of both its French and Japanese occupiers. On August 14, 1945, with the backing of the United States, Ho Chi Minh launched the August Revolution, which effectively saw the Viet Minh take control from the Japanese. However, the French were far more reluctant. On September 2, 1945, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam was declared. After World War II, the Allies gave South Vietnam back to the French and the North to non-communist China. In the North, China treated the Vietnamese very badly and support for Ho Chi Minh grew. Because of their own revolution in 1946, the Chinese pulled out and the Viet Minh took control of the North. Under pressure from the Soviet Union, Ho Chi Minh sought to negotiate with the French. The Viet Minh were assured they would gain independence in the French Union. However, having no intentions of this, in December 1946, French forces shelled the city of Haiphong and forcibly re-entered the capital, Hanoi. Such began the First Indochina War. For years, Minh had asked the U.S. to support him against the French. However, the United States was fully dedicated to their Cold War foreign policy of containment and belief in the domino theory, both to prevent the spread of communism. In 1949, fighting escalated when Chinese Communist forces began sending supplies. In November 1953, the French sent a parachute regiment, assuming that they would defeat the Vietnamese. However, the French forces were no match for the now well-armed, direct-engaging, and superior guerrilla fighters, and ultimately lost in a decisive blow at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. In April 1954, the world powers met in Geneva to discuss various issues. One such was that of Indochina. With the Geneva Accords, it was decided that the country would be divided at the 17th parallel, as French troops peacefully evacuated. The Communist North would be led by Ho Chi Minh, while the non-Communist South would have the final Emperor of Vietnam, Bao Dai, act as chief of state. Additionally, in 1956, there would be an election throughout the entire country, administered by a neutral country to decide one leader. However, by 1956, the division had become permanent and there was no election. After the division, the Viet Minh sent people to the south to spread the word of communism. They were seen as courteous and helpful, especially on southern farms. Since the U.S. refused the election, fearing communists would win, they only carried out the election in the south. After eliminating his competitors, Ngo Dinh Diem was elected prime minister. Diem was a fanatical Catholic and thus hated communists because they hated religion. His rule was one of corruptness and brutality. He hated both communists and Buddhists. As a result, he executed 12,000 opposition members and jailed over 40,000. In 1957, low-level guerrilla movements conducted by the Viet Minh began in the south with units who had not left after the Accords. Military supplies began to flow through the infamous Ho Chi Minh Trail, hidden in the jungles of neighboring Laos and Cambodia. The following year, the National Front for Liberation of South Vietnam, known as the Viet Cong, was established to carry out the fight. As a quick side note, on June 11, 1963, a Buddhist monk named Thi Quang Duc set himself on fire in a busy street in Saigon, South Vietnam, to protest Diem's regime. In 1961, the Kennedy administration promised more aid to the South, but this was sent with little effect. They also sent advisors to help train the South Army. However, President Kennedy remained against the use of ground troops. On November 2, 1963, with the help of the CIA, the South Army overthrew and assassinated Prime Minister Diem. One of the first major events on August 2, 1964, an American warship, the USS Maddox, was conducting intelligence and attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin by North Vietnamese torpedoes. A supposed second attack led to the passing of the Southeast Asia Resolution, which permitted the president to conduct military operations in the region without a formal declaration of war. Beginning March 2, 1965, LBJ authorized Operation Rolling Thunder, which lasted over 3 years, dropping on the North an average of 800 tons of bombs each day. President Johnson immediately authorized 3,500 Marines to be deployed. In March 1965, he authorized the first 60,000 troops to Vietnam. The troops are commanded by General William Westmoreland, who in the summer of 1965 achieved victory at Chu Lai, Operation Starlight, and Ia Drang. Learning from these defeats, the Viet Cong only engaged American forces in hit-and-run ambushes, while Americans focused on eliminating Viet Cong forces in the south, capturing large amounts of supplies with little engagement of the enemy. President Johnson created a goal for U.S. involvement. It stated that it was not a war to win, but instead to bolster South Vietnam's defenses until they could take over. However, he set the stage for future disappointment when the U.S. found themselves in a stalemate. From 1965 to 69, the U.S. engaged in a limited war. This meant that fighting only occurred in the south and there was no serious assault in the north or of the Ho Chi Minh supply trail. In 1967, the North Vietnamese leadership seriously debated how to move forward. So far, they had been achieving nominal success in jungle warfare against Americans. Having suffered heavy losses in their economy and infrastructure due to U.S. bombing, a large offensive assault was planned. The North banked on the fact that American involvement in the war was increasingly unpopular and hoped that they could incite a revolt. In January 1968, the North attacked U.S. Marines at Kieu Son, hoping to confuse and distract them and draw forces out of the cities. Overall, they bombed and raided over 100 cities and villages in the south. Their goal was to destroy the South Vietnamese government and army. This was highly undetected because they broke the traditional Tet ceasefire on Vietnamese New Year. The largest attacks were carried out in Hue and Saigon. Public support on the home front began to erode after this event. It showed everyone that the enemy was stronger and more organized than ever believed, and this shook the confidence of the American people, even if in reality the Viet Cong and North were severely crippled by the victorious American and South forces. This was largely due to the media's involvement. The media stressed the credibility gap and distrust in President Johnson's leadership. It was the media who forced the president to open peace talks. Overall, this was the major turning point in the war. On February 1st, 1968, a South Vietnamese general, Nguyen Ngoc Lan, assassinated a Viet Cong prisoner, Nguyen Lan Diem. The reason this event was so impactful was that the assassination was done on live TV. In March of the same year, in the village of Son Mai, American troops from Company C killed up to 500 men, women, and children in the My Lai massacre. The repercussions of this event were largely due to the large cover-up of it, when it was not released to the public until 8 months later. Opposition to the war on the home front was due to four main reasons. The first was the hatred of the American draft, which forced military conscription if chosen. The second was the previously mentioned Tet Offensive, which rocked the foundations of the American people. The third, and possibly largest, was the belief that the U.S. had imperialistic intentions in the area. Especially when the fighting spilled over to Cambodia, the people could no longer get behind the belief that it was just about containing communism. The actions were seen as immoral, especially by college students. The final reason was the widespread media coverage of the war. This was the first war where such an extent of media was used. Obviously, with events such as the My Lai massacre, the Burning Monk televised assassination, and the horrible conditions, the American people were appalled at what they saw. In 1968, Richard Nixon was elected president after Johnson withdrew re-election. As president, Nixon's plan for Vietnam was known as Vietnamization. It had several parts. The first was to build up the South Army so they could fight on their own. A part of this plan was beginning in 1969 the slow removal of American troops. To bring a faster end to hostilities, Nixon also expanded the war into Laos and Cambodia. The new policy was also aimed at taking a defensive position, especially of the local villages. In 1970, forces also began attacking Cambodia, supposedly to eliminate a threat across the border, but it was publicly viewed as expanding the war. Public opinion sank lower when in 1971 the Pentagon Papers were leaked. They detailed all the American mistakes and cover-ups in the Vietnam War. The same year, the South Army commenced an operation to sever the Ho Chi Minh Trail. However, it failed. The North also carried out the Easter Offensive, which pushed into the South. With the failure of the Easter Offensive, the North leader, Le Duc Pho, became concerned that they would be isolated if Nixon's détente policy softened U.S. relations with the Soviet Union and China. As a result, he softened the North's position in peace negotiations, stating that the South government could remain in power. After creating a successful draft, South President Nguyen Van Thu was butthurt for not being a part of the negotiations and demanded alterations. In response, the North stalled negotiations. Feeling they had embarrassed him, Nixon ordered the bombing of Hanoi in late December 1972. On January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, which called for the complete ceasefire and for the North and South to figure out a political solution. Long story short, after the last American troops left, the North was able to overcome the South and united the entire country under communism. The U.S. experienced huge consequences as a result of the war. It greatly damaged the U.S. economy. It spurred huge policy changes, especially in regards to foreign relations and Cold War policy. It largely contributed to establishing the voting age at 18. It ended the current draft system in U.S. conscription, and it also developed a widespread mistrust of the government by the American people. The casualties are as follows. The USA, 58,119 dead, 53,303 wounded, and 1,948 missing in action. In the South, they had 230,000 dead and 1,169,763 wounded. In the North, there were 1.1 million dead and an unknown amount wounded. Between 2 and 4 million Vietnamese citizens were killed in this conflict.